Hello, and welcome to the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective. I'm Tony Aguilar. On this week's segment, we'll look into the crisis of Sudan, an area that is marked by prolonged violence, political instability, and a rapidly worsening humanitarian situation. Millions of civilians have been displaced, essential services have collapsed, and access to food, health care, and safety remains critically limited. We will explore the historical and political roots of the conflict, examine the roles of key actors, and assess the response of the international community. Can the crisis in Sudan be resolved? Next. Joining me today is Dr. Khalid Madani, the Associate Professor of Political Science and Islamic Studies at McGill University. He is also the Director of the Institute of Islamic Studies and Chair of African Studies, also at McGill. Dr. Madani is the author of Black Markets and Militants, Informal Networks in the Middle East and Africa. Dr. Madani, thanks for joining me today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.
Let me start off with this. Since Sudan had its independence in 1956, it has been in the midst of a civil war for more years than it has not. Can you explain why that is?
Yes, thank you. Well, there are a number of reasons. It has, in fact, experienced the greatest numbers of civil wars on the continent of Africa and the longest civil war that ended in 2011 with the secession of South Sudan.
Right.
Usually, we begin explaining this unfortunate kind of development by looking at the colonial history very briefly. Sudan was colonized by the British. Initially in the late 1800s, and then there was a resistance against British colonization by a group of Islamist or Islamic-oriented fighters led by a very famous historical figure by the name of Muhammad al-Mahdi, very well known in the Islamic world and in Africa and the Middle East. But there was a reconquest of Sudan by the British. Following that reconquest by the early 1900s, essentially Sudan was administered separately. It was administered separately as two different districts. In the north, the majority Muslim, majority population were privileged economically and politically by the British. And in the south, where you have the majority of those who are elites are Christian and the majority of South Sudanese practice traditional African religions. Essentially, the British by 1922 established what they called the Closed District Ordinance, which essentially forbid the interaction between North and South, not only culturally, but most importantly in terms of trade and economic relations. So by the time that there was independence that was announced in 1955, and then officially Sudan became independence a year later, you had essentially two separate regions, culturally, economically, and politically, North and South. It's of course a story that's familiar to those who know of not only African history, but Middle Eastern history, this policy of divide and rule that has bedeviled Sudan since the beginning of its independence. And what happened as early as 1955 is that a group of insurgents in South Sudan began a war first by attacking a military garrison in the south, and then the northern regions and military installations. The group was called Anyanya Forces. And they essentially waged a war because they felt that the North was privileged historically under the colonial rule, and they were concerned about the Islamic Arab dominance over their region. And so there were political and economic grievances that really instigated that war, that really began, unfortunately, to affect the entire country. That war saw a brief peace in the mid-1970s, brokered by the then Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, in 1973 and 74 under the Sudanese leader, Jafar Nimeri. But that, unfortunately, that brief peace was interrupted very crucially in 1983 because in the South, oil was discovered. And the first real oil company to pursue the excavation of oil was actually the American company Chevron.
Could you also include during that time, because Sudan was under the auspices of both Great Britain and Egypt? How does Egypt fit into this?
Absolutely. The initial colonization of Sudan really was under both administrations, the Egyptian and the British Association. And this was a unique kind of historical development in the African continent. Sudan was essentially administered by both countries under what was called at the time the Anglo-Egyptian condominium. But the truth of the matter is that while Egyptian soldiers and administrators were sent to Sudan to administer mostly northern Sudan, it was really under British and dominion. The British, of course, at the time had nominal control over Egypt, although Egypt was nominally independent, and this was before the revolution in Egypt of the 1950s. And so, essentially, Egypt, or rather Britain, did have the greatest say in terms of the policies, legal, political, and cultural. There was absolutely a policy of cultural separation. The British historically in Africa, I should tell you, Mr. Aguilar, were very hesitant to amalgamate Muslim African regions and territories with non-Muslim territories. And they also had a great deal of apprehension with respect to the Islamic population throughout Muslim Africa. The Islamist resistance and Muslim resistance throughout the Sahel and Nigeria and Sudan represented a real strategic and military and cultural threat. And so they thought the best way to really kind of discipline and put these kind of resistance movements down was to separate Muslim populations from non-Muslim populations in Africa. So it was just like the divide and rule policy, something that the British devised throughout the continent. And so that is really an important element of the historical aspect. So to answer your question about the genesis of these wars in Sudan, there is absolutely no little debate as to the central role and formidable role that the colonial policy of divide and rule played. And this you can see across the continent. Almost every civil war in the continent of Africa, including the war in Nigeria, in Biafra region in the 1960s, was really a result of the same kind of policies. So Sudan is an example very much of the consequences of divide and rule policy on the part of European colonialists in Sudan.
Now, the recent iteration, or the most recent iteration of the civil war in Sudan, is between the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces. Because at one point, they had actually come together to oust Omar al-Bashir. And now they are warring against each other, which has created what many people say is the greatest humanitarian crisis in probably 100 years. And so why are they fighting against each other? I know because Hamadi, they talked about him being brought into the armed forces, and he was against that. But why are they fighting and creating the travesty that they're creating?
Well, that's such a central question, Mr. Aguilar. Thank you for asking it, because there is a confusion because, of course, you see the devastation of the war, over 12 million displaced, over 5 million made refugees, the litany of human rights violations that we see. It's absolutely perhaps Africa's worst humanitarian crisis since the independence era. These two antagonists, the leader of the militia, the Rapid Support Forces, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo Hemeti, and the head of the Sudan Armed Forces, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, were, as you said, in partnership under the previous regime. And in summary, I think it's important to link this to the very important war in Darfur that many of your listeners may be familiar with in the early 2000s. The previous regime led by Omar al-Bashir, which was backed by the Islamist movement in Sudan, utilized militias. They literally created the militias, the precursor of the Rapid Support Forces. At that time, of course, they were called the Janjaweed. And of course, I think many Americans remember and recall the devastation duration of that war. Umar Bashir at the time, under what was called the Single Party, National Congress Party, established, financed the Janjaweed for two reasons. One of them was to put down the insurgent Darfurians who were, agitating for political freedoms, but also resource sharing in the marginalized region of Darfur. But the other reason was to put down dissent in the urban areas and the capital, calling for democracy. So in the early 2000s, Umar Bashir and his military regime essentially sponsored and created the precursor to the Rapid Support Forces. Following that war, in 2013, that Janjaweed militia was transformed into the Rapid Support Forces by the central government. And here you see the partnership really cemented between the central government and the militia. And I should mention that the two antagonists and generals fighting now actually fought together in Darfur in partnership to really, put down the insurgency in Darfur. And so I think that there's been, and people need to know, there was 2 decades of strong military partnership between the Rapid Support Forces and militia. In 2017, the Rapid Support Forces was actually under law, under the constitution at the time, made a formal it was made a formal branch of the Sudan Armed Forces. So the partnership became even closer. And that continued very pivotably until something very, very important in late 2018, when the Sudanese people in their millions protested and brought down that regime. The partnership between Hemedti and Burhan continued following that revolution. There was a brief partnership with civilian leaders, and then they continued to partner with each other against this pro-democracy movement, waging a military coup, very important date in October 2021, where both of them agreed to overthrow the experiment in a transition to a civilian democracy, and that partnership continued. The protest, however, continued among Sudanese, calling for democracy very famously. And by late 2022, both parties were forced to once again engage with the civilian leaders and political parties under something called the Framework Agreement. And here is where the differences between these two generals emerge, leading to the war. There were two contentious issues associated with this framework agreement that would herald this horrible and brutal war. One of them was an agreement over the dismantling of the economic and financial assets of both of them. Over 3 decades of corruption led to a financial empire on the part of both the Sudan Armed Forces leadership and the Rapid Support Forces leadership and the family of the Dalo. That was one contentious issue. The other one, Mr. Aguilar, that is even more important is differences over security sector reform, and specifically the merging of this militia finally officially into the Sudan Armed Forces. That, of course, would undermine, if it actually was realized, the military strength of the Rapid Support Forces. So that becomes a really important element. In addition to that, speaking to politicians at the time, very recently in Egypt, they reminded me to tell journalists like you that there was also a difference in terms of command and control. The militia leader wanted to be eventually under the oversight of a civilian prime minister, whereas Burhan, the current leader of the army, wanted him under his control. That became a contentious issue. It boiled up in April of 2023, and the catalyst to the war were Islamist militias allied with the Sudan Armed Forces that basically attacked the Rapid Support Forces in the capital Khartoum, and that quickly spiraled into a game of chicken, so to speak, for lack of a better term, that began first in the capital, as both of them wanted to decimate the other. The leadership of the army, believe it or not, thought that they would have a quick victory, 2 weeks, and the Rapid Support militia would be extinguished and exterminated. Of course, that did not happen. Khartoum, the capital, begins to go up in flames as a result of the war, and quickly, unfortunately, the war expands throughout the region, particularly in Western Darfur.
Let me ask you this, because it sounds like, in terms of these two gentlemen, this is nothing more than a power struggle. And which a lot of nations have gone through, and we understand that. But there's also the international connection to this. For example, what is known as the Quad, the United States, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and UAE. And it's been suggested that UAE has been funding the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, to maintain their military forces to take over the country. Is that accurate? Because there seems to be a lot of proof of that. The second thing is that Sudan has been declared as a place where genocide is presently taking place. But that has not led to nations trying to stop it. And so I'm wondering, what role does the international community play make in terms of not stopping the genocide? For example, there's a lot of people who have said that the United States could stop UAE if it really wanted to, that it has that influence, stopping them from arming the RSF. Number one, is that accurate? And number two, can the international community put an end to this travesty?
These are excellent questions. I always like to emphasize, particularly in shows like yours that give us sufficient time to emphasize the history and the local dynamics of the war. And that is that the roots of the war are domestic. As someone who's an academic, but also Sudanese, I can tell you that very confidently. So, and as we know, for those of us who teach African politics, the roots of the wars in Africa are historical and local. But the sustaining of the war, the changing dynamics, absolutely, of course, are directly affected by external actors and foreign actors. And so that is something that is extremely negative, but it points to the kind of pathway towards resolution with respect to your question of the role of the international actors. To begin with your first question about the UAE, absolutely, like many countries, Sudan is bordered by 7 countries, and most importantly, it borders the Sahel region and the Red Sea regions, very strategic areas, particularly the Red Sea region. And of course, it is one of the richest countries, not only in Africa in terms of resources, but throughout the world. It is, for example, the 3rd largest exporter of gold in Africa, the 12th largest in the continent, in the world. So the UAE has a role to play in terms of its strategic and financial interest in Sudan, including agriculture. We can talk about that in detail, but it's very important because I understand people focus on the UAE to understand that the other side also has historically and continues to be supported by another group of countries, which includes Saudi Arabia, Egypt, recently Turkey, even Iran, with respect to arms supplies, for example. So no, there are no good guys in this particular scenario, Mr. Aguilar, and it's very important to understand that. Why? Why is it important to understand that the UAE is supporting one side and then a bunch of other countries in the region are supporting the other? Because that, of course, points us to resolution, the pathways to peace. And the pathways to peace in this scenario, in this context, when both sides are implementing human rights violations and both sides are generating support and eliciting support from the outside, is that it requires comprehensive coordination. Understanding that these different regional powers, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the UAE, as 3 important examples, have different interests in Sudan, are supporting different sides, necessitates really pushing them towards coordinating their own efforts to bring a truce and a ceasefire and over time sustainable peace. This is, if you read the Quad statement by the United States, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt of September 12th, I would encourage your listeners to look at it very quickly. It has 2 very important points. One is that there is no military resolution to the conflict. It must be political. And the other one actually, very importantly, acknowledges, Mr. Aguilar, that external actors are part of the problem. In that sense, it's a very interesting document, and it can form the basis for negotiations. And what we see now in terms of the military changes on the ground and dynamics is that both sides understand the pressure being put upon them by this kind of coalition of countries under the Quad. And they are, unfortunately, basically, as one wonderful Sudanese activist that I respect put it, there's a race on the ground with respect to amassing territory and, of course, military authority over these different regions in preparation, I would argue, to the possibility of peace, of negotiation, so to speak. In other words, that is something that most warring factions really calculate. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. Both sides are at fault. At the same time, both sides benefit from external interventions and support, but also they actually are affected by external pressure as well. And so that is what we're seeing right now. In terms of the genocidal aspect, that is a question that has a legal component because you have to determine intent. And I would argue that the violations in Darfur are ethnic cleansing, proxy war, scorched earth policies. The issue of intent, of course, has to be narrowly defined to highlight the specific individuals and actors involved, but not the entire Sudanese population. I hope that that makes sense. Why the
It
United
does,
Nations?
but if I can stop you for a moment, I know that, I mean, the U.S., certain humanitarian organizations have declared it a genocide. And there has been at least one person who's been convicted of genocide by the ICC. So there is a legal framework in terms of genocidal intentions there. Al-Bashir himself, warrants were issued for his arrest for participation in genocide. And I asked that question because, back in, I guess, in the 90s when Bill Clinton was president and Sudan was deemed a terrorist state, and Clinton did authorize the bombing of Sudan. And you see in Nigeria now where the Trump administration has authorized the bombing in Nigeria. So it seems to me that when these nations want to act, they do act. And so the atrocities that has been committed in Sudan by both sides thus far is way more than the atrocities that might have been committed by the terrorists that Clinton said was there, or by what's going on in Nigeria. And yet the nations do nothing. And so my question is, why is that? And I guess it's the broader question because the UN itself does not really do anything at this stage. What would make the international community really get involved as it did in Gaza and Israel, as it's doing in Russia and Ukraine? What would it take to get to that point?
That's a very key question. I think that the examples you mentioned of the early 2000s with Clinton and then Colin Powell as well under the Bush administration, on one hand, declaring officially on the part of the United States a genocide in Darfur, and if the United Nations were to formally declare that, would require, of course, intervention in terms of international law, as you know, and that is something that the United States has refused to do since its debacle in Somalia, if you remember. And so that has been historically the strategic kind of obstruction, so to speak, the lack of political will in that respect and regard. Another is that, as you know, with respect to the conflict in Gaza and Nigeria, which is essentially a unilateral kind of strike on the part of the United States, is that the Security Council and the United Nations in general, as you know, are deeply unequal. That is a problem, and deeply politicized. There is absolutely no question that the United States has close relations with the United Arab Emirates, for example. It is one of its biggest military suppliers and defense contractors. And that, of course, obstructs the United States. That's just one answer to why the United States won't declare it a genocide. Another one has to do with strategic interest, Mr. Aguilar, from my perspective. And that is that there is the issue of the racialization of wars in Africa that somehow are less important. That is something that is so important to highlight because it's so intuitive, people forget about it. And another aspect really is the strategic importance of Sudan. So what would it take to answer your question is the understanding on the part of regional actors who are closely allied with the United States and other countries that this is not just a Sudan problem. whether it's Gaza and Nigeria for a variety of domestic political reasons become important strategically and politically for the US administration is clear, right? That, for example, the war in Gaza on the population of Gaza and Palestinians in general is something that affects the region and the very important powers in Europe and the West and elsewhere. Sudan is this peripheral country that initially, when the war began, there was, of course, calls for humanitarian intervention, but rarely for political intervention, right? And the reason for that is this lack of understanding. I'm talking here in terms of understanding international relations and politics, that Sudan did not figure prominently strategically, whether it is in economic sense or a strategic sense. That has gradually changed, Mr. Aguilar, to answer your question. We've said this from the very beginning of the war, the long stretch of the Red Sea coast, the events happening in Yemen, the recognition of Israel of Somaliland, the expansion of the war through the Red Sea region across Bab el-Mandeb and the Gulf of Aden. On the other side, the issue of Libya, of course, and the Sahel, that has all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but I frankly predicted it would happen, has brought countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and UAE under extreme pressure because they are increasingly understanding that their own economic and strategic interests may be gravely undermined. And it is for that reason, for example, that the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, actually, as you know, told Trump that he needs to fix Sudan. And Trump, of course, made that speech about the importance of doing that. So to answer your question more briefly in a kind of strategic and objective sense, aside from the humanitarian issue, is when these countries find it, unfortunately, I believe the humanitarian issue is the most important, but when these countries find it under their security and strategic interest to end the war in Sudan, that is where we see the possibilities. So talking to Sudanese recently, there's been a shift in terms of public discourse among all Sudanese, and I have interviewed them extensively, and that is there's an increasing consensus, and I would like your listeners to understand, to prioritize the end of the war. As you know, in wars like this, there is, and I'm sure you've interviewed others who have different perspectives on the war in Sudan. And understandably so, it's a brutal war where there is great anger, resentment, frustration, and enmity, of course, among the different groups. But there's an increasing consensus that first and foremost, the war must be stopped. That's really essential. We think always of our families. All of us have lost our homes, and all our families have been devastated throughout the country. And so the severity of the war, its broad kind of phase and deepening, has led Sudanese to try to prioritize the end of the war and then step by step look towards a civilian democratic kind of transition. What that means is that there is a consensus with many kind of critiques around the Quad. There is a consensus that's a framework such as the Quad that actually brings together these regional superpowers, some that are acting basically as sub-imperial powers in Africa and Sudan, to bring them together in a way to actually put pressure on their proxies, so to speak, to come together to the table, because that's the priority. And so here is really an emphasis on what can be done with the international community. So there are two things, if you don't mind me adding. One of them is to strengthen that, you have to bring in more vested interest. You have to bring in countries like Qatar, like Turkey, under the framework, because they're so important and they have vested interest in the Red Sea. Another thing is to bring in meaningfully African countries that so far have not participated in these negotiations. They have supported the Quad rhetorically, but we haven't seen Kenya, IGAD, the regional bloc of the Horn of Africa. And finally, and most importantly, most Sudanese will tell you, who are not aligned to either party, warring faction, that it's crucial to understand the will of the Sudanese people, and the root causes of this war has to do with the will of the Sudanese people and hope for a civilian democratic transition. And you have to include civilian political parties, civilians in this framework, so that they can actually establish the agenda for peace.
So where's the African Union fit in all of this?
The African Union has really, unfortunately, abrogated its responsibility. They played a very important role, a crucial role during the revolution. It was the African Union that actually pushed Sudan out of the organization because of its war against the pro-democracy revolution. In October 2021, the leader of the Sudan Armed Forces, the current de facto leader of Sudan, tried very hard to bring to request of the African Union that Sudan be once again a member of the African Union. And so far, the African Union has refused. As you know, their mandate cannot allow them to actually accept a leadership in Africa that has come to power through a military coup. But unfortunately, they have been divided with respect to their separate interests. Kenya and the Kenyan leadership is generally supportive of the Rapid Support Forces militia, has a long history of supporting. President Ruto is a close friend of Hemeti, and that has been a problem. That has changed. That has changed with something very important, Mr. Aguilar, and that is that last year or half a year ago, you had the establishment of a parallel government in Darfur by the Rapid Support Forces militia. That all of a sudden, as you know, the African Union and all African countries fear one thing and one thing the most, and that is the secession of an African country and the division of African territories for historical reasons and contemporary political reasons. And
Which is
here
what
is
happened with South Sudan.
absolutely, and it's what's happened with Eritrea and Ethiopia,
Right.
which has happened de facto with Somaliland and Somalia. And so the African Union knows full well that this endangers all of the African countries as precedent. And so here you find new energy. First of all, a complete kind of refusal to recognize a parallel government that's not voted by the Sudanese people and threatens the separation of Sudan, and now has energetically come to support an international coordinating body such as the Quad. And so there is great movement with African countries to actually support an internationally kind of Quad that's comprehensive and coordinated. And I predict that the African Union will play a greater role in these negotiations in the future if the Quad continues.
I want to touch briefly on the refugee crisis. As you said, Sudan borders seven nations, seven African nations. How are the other nations responding to the migration crisis that's going on right now? For example, you're now in Cairo, in Egypt, to the north of Sudan. How is that working out? Because immigration on a worldwide basis right now is being seen as a negative thing. So, how are countries dealing with the immigration issue now that's occurring because of the war in Sudan? I mean, you have millions of people that have been displaced, not to speak of hundreds of thousands of people who have been killed. But the migration issue itself, how is that working out around the seven nations that borders Sudan?
Thank you so much for posing that question, Mr. Aguilar. It is rarely posed. And one of the reasons it's so important is that it's a very difficult situation. We must, and of course, always emphasize the war in Sudan itself and the displacement. But the refugee issue has become really central, with Sudanese really laboring under very difficult conditions. Every country is a bit different. In the case of Egypt, initially there was an open border policy and then immediate restrictions based not only on ethnicity, but also on age, but also issues associated, to be quite very direct, in terms of the possibility of actually making a living in these countries. Really, the prohibition of Sudanese refugees actually entering the labor market, for example, in Egypt, and every 6 months you have to pay in order to have a temporary permit that does not allow you to work, but allows you to reside. There is also the intervention, I would like your listeners to keep in mind, of the linkage between these difficulties and the immigration issues in Europe. The EU has spent and is spending millions of dollars, not only in Egypt, but also, let's say, countries like Morocco, to actually encourage and insist that these countries actually limit the passage of refugees into their territories. I can't emphasize that enough. I think that your listeners listeners may not be aware that in 2015, there was something called the Khartoum process, where the European Union gave millions of dollars to Hemeti, the current leader of the Rapid Support Forces, in order to play a border patrol chief. That led not only to violence and human rights violations, but human trafficking as a result of the European Union's insistence on limiting the flow of refugees in violation of international humanitarian law, by the way. There are some countries like Chad that one has to recognize as having more open borders, but that has very much to do with the fact that their ethnic kin, the Zaghawa, for example, in Darfur, have kin relations with those in Chad. But recently, Chad has been just yesterday, they were very, very concerned about cross-border drone attacks in their own territory. The country that has been the most generous, and I want to emphasize this, has been South Sudan. Imagine a country that has fought 40 years against the northern neighbor who has opened its borders the most freely, even though it's undergoing a great deal of violence. That's not really a result
And they've
just of
had their own civil war.
they continue to have it, but it's the South Sudanese people who have insisted that they are kin in the north. And this is an element of African generosity that I can explain in historical sense, but in any sense. Ethiopia, of course, is much difficult also, not only for legal reasons like Egypt, but because of strategic reasons, which is important. Ethiopia is really concerned of opposition movements in Sudan that would destabilize their regime because of the closeness of the border. So their political, legal, bureaucratic restrictions that basically are the topic of conversations of Sudanese families, including my own, every day of the week. Traversing all of this without the support of the international community, because these governments have such a strong hold on these legal and bureaucratic obstacles, is something that's really important. There's also been a problem with America, Canada, where I live, and others that have basically restricted not only normal immigration from Sudan per se, as you know, but also restricted humanitarian pathways in terms of even applying for for asylum. So the restrictions globally that you see affecting other populations who try to come to the United States apply, in double fold, so to speak, or even more with respect to Sudan. And you will see it, unfortunately, in the rhetoric, the racialized and racist rhetoric of Somalis, Sudanese. All of that, of course, is one of the limitations of immigration. As a mentor of mine always said to me, always remind people about the xenophobic barriers of immigration. And that is something that we have to keep in mind with respect to discrimination of African and Black refugees in the continent and Europe and the United States.
I want to touch on the issue because at some point this war will come to an end. We hope. How does Sudan get rebuilt? I know when President Clinton placed Sudan on the terrorist list, President Trump removed them from the terrorist list in exchange for Sudan's recognition of Israel as part of the Abraham Accords, which gave them access again to various funding streams such as the World Bank and the like. Number one, has that helped? Number two, how is Sudan going to be rebuilt, both politically and from a perspective of physical infrastructure? How is that going to happen?
Well, in terms of your first question, with respect to the coercive diplomacy that occurred following the revolution of December 2018, that is in exchange for normalization with Israel that has its own political and strategic issues for a country like Sudan and Sudanese in general. You opened up, or you lifted Sudan from a list of states sponsoring terrorism. And of course, most importantly, you lifted sanctions that had been in place for 20 decades. That in itself absolutely helped, in the sense that if you talk to Sudanese, I want to be objective, imagine 20 years of draconian sanctions and the openness that saw the potential of economic openness, trade and investment, but most importantly for Sudanese, a notion of economic sovereignty over their own dominion and economic sovereignty, economic development. So that was very, very promising. However, it was short-lived in terms of the coup that occurred in October 2021. In fact, that coup, the framework agreement that came afterward was because Burhan, the leader, was concerned about the World Bank and other institutions boycotting Sudan. So I think that it was short-lived. The people that were put in place were implementing policies that, in my opinion, were not conducive to development, but nevertheless, it's difficult to judge because it was about a 2-year process. I think to answer your second question, which is important, is the framework for the rebuilding of Sudan is there. The framework agreement I mentioned was one that was brokered by the international community, but really designed, this may be of interest to you, by professionals in Sudan, and specifically the Lawyers Association. I'm sure you have many legal friends, and you know that they are very good at constitutional building. The framework that was built was not built by foreigners, that was negotiated at the time, but by the Lawyers Union in Sudan, very, very competent professionals. And it really underpinned the transition. It included a transition of technocrats for the first period of the transition, included the mechanisms for the establishment of the parliament over a 2-year period, a variety of different elements, and most importantly, 2 different things. That is economic policy for reconstruction and rebuilding, and security sector reform. So Sudan requires first a truce, and then this transition that is something that Mr. Aguilar has occurred in other African countries. I tell people always, number one, wars in Africa have ended. Look at Rwanda, Liberia, Sierra Leone, many of these. I have students from all of these countries over the years. And there is a process well known in terms of peacemaking and then peace building that requires security sector reform, that with specific guarantees, legal, bureaucratic, and by the international community. And in terms of the reconstruction financially of the infrastructure, Sudan is so wealthy, so there is a curse associated with that. There is already interest among countries and foreign direct investments and firms over Sudan's gold, uranium, oil, and agricultural resources and water resources. That, if not done under a framework of a transition and a transitional constitution, would become what it is now, which is essentially a war economy, where Sudan and the leaders are selling off assets left and right, destroying the economy and the infrastructure even more, but also fueling the war. Gold is a very good example. So I don't think that there would be a shortage of people interested in helping Sudan reconstruct. In fact, there are a number of different actors that would be very, very interested, and they continue to be. Look at the interventions of 7, if not more, countries already. So that requires a transition under a technocratic government that takes seriously security sector reform. I would really encourage people, if they're interested, to look at the framework agreement that was brokered by the international community, that was violated by both Hemeti and Burhan, these protagonists. So I do think there's hope. There are also examples, and I'm looking at some of them now with respect to Rwanda, Liberia, Sierra Leone. The Liberian war in particular is instructive because it took 9 years for the transition to actually establish a relatively stable and democratic government, despite the many challenges. Rwanda, of course, is the darling of Africa in terms of its economic development, although we can criticize, if you'd like, a little bit of issues associated with political freedoms, but nevertheless, the leadership has been able to have transitional justice, security sector reform, and move the country to economic development. So we're going to rely on African examples here to move forward.
Let me ask you a question in the minute that we have remaining. I know there was a meeting called by the AU between the Sudanese armed forces and proxies of the RSF. Now, the Sudanese army said they didn't want to do it because they didn't want the folks who represented RSF to be there. Can this situation be resolved without both parties being at the table? I mean, can it be resolved? I mean, it seems to me that both have to be at the table somewhere because the RSF, quite frankly, is right now, militarily speaking, as far as I can see, beating the Sudanese armed forces.
Yeah.
So, how does this happen without the 2 men being at the table and perhaps coming to an agreement that ends the war and that says that we should not have military rule, we should have civilian rule, with perhaps an international body that oversees this process?
To answer your question directly, no. From what we understand, Sudanese history, politics, and other cases, a mutually hurting stalemate is what we see now in Sudan, which I predicted in the first day of the war, frankly, really must lead to political negotiation. But here is the issue, and I want to be very direct about this. There is what we call the spoiler. There's a reason the Sudan armed forces have refused, and that is because of its constituency, a small clique of Islamist cadres from the former regime. That is, by the way, Mr. Aguilar, widely acknowledged. So moving forward, it's important, without being hyperbolic, it's important to understand that there's one faction that feels peace is against their interest. The long-term sustainable peace. We've talked about the RSF and its issues, but here there's a reason that the military leader Burhan has refused a truce and has refused to meet and has continued to, and has also criticized directly the Quad itself. And that is because the remnants of what we call the remnants of the former Islamist-backed regime feel that peace would be against their interests, because the Sudanese revolution had said that because of their violations and practices over the past 3 decades, that they must be excluded unless they reform in particular kind of disciplinary ways that promote democracy. And so what is important to highlight here in conclusion is that the Sudanese population want a professional army that actually has the public interest in their sights. And that requires a political army that is not politicized, that it is not basically every time Burhan wants to negotiate, that he's basically essentially pressured by an Islamist movement and the former remnants. They must be isolated. Burhan or his leadership must be encouraged to actually distance themselves in a practical sense and in very clear sense from this constituency that has everything to gain from war and everything to lose from peace.
My guest today has been Dr. Khalid Madani, Associate Professor of Political Science and Islamic Studies at McGill University in Canada. Dr. Madani, thanks for joining me today.
It's been my honor. Thank you so much for covering Sudan. Much appreciated.
Thank you. And join us again next week as we cover another topic here on the Aguilar Conversations, A Global Perspective.